Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a place where we discuss history and theology. This is a new channel, and I would ask that you would please like this video. And if you find the content helpful, to consider subscribing or sharing it with others. Thank you. Today, we're looking at the fall and rise of the medieval papacy. This is a three-part series, and I would suggest that you go back and watch the first part, the Pornocracy, the Saeculum Obscurorum, that is the Dark Ages of the papacy, so that the second part here will make sense, so you can see where we're coming from and where we're going. Today, we're looking at the seeds of reform. So a little backstory before we get into the reform movement itself. And I want to take just a moment here to look at the medieval feudal system as a whole and as it relates to the monastic life. So, as many of you are probably aware, the medieval system was very much a pyramid system, where on the bottom you have the peasants, the serfs, the people that work the land. In the upper rank, right above that, you would have had the knights, who are the vassals to the lords and the nobility. Above that, you have the lords themselves, who are vassals to the king, and the king who would, at least in principle, sit on the top of this whole system. Now, with monastic houses, the people at the bottom, the serfs, did not actually own the land that they lived on. The land was, in theory, owned by the king, who in turn parceled it out to various lords and nobility. And within any given area, within any given province, you would have these monastic houses. So the monastic houses were directly tied to the land that was owned by the lords or the kings. So there was a deep intertwining as the medieval system gets underway and as this feudal system gets underway, where the houses, the monastic houses, were under the protection, in the best of times, of the lords and vassals, or in the worst, and oftentimes is the case, under the influence of the lords or the kings. And there's one thing to bring into this is the wealth that is involved in this. We know when William the Conqueror landed in England in 1066, he found that the monastic houses in England owned up to 6%, or excuse me, 1/6 of the wealth of the entire land. And that's a lot of money. So it was in the interest of the lords and the kings to have sway over these monastic houses to control the flow of money. Then we get to William, Duke of Aquitaine, and something interesting happens here. William, Duke of Aquitaine, he's a Frank, and he's part of this French, we're coming out of a time when the Franks are barbarians and they're becoming Christianized. And we want to use that term loosely because many of these men were still more barbarian than they were Christian. Let's just put it that way. William, Duke of Aquitaine, is not much different. He's a rough and tumble kind of guy. Think of a just a tough knight who's been in the ravages of war, and it's even said that he had killed someone in a fit of rage. So we're talking about a tough man here. Let's just put it that way. Now, William has no heirs. And one thing that sets him apart from his other Frankish knightly class is that his sins seem to have weighed deep on his conscience. So we have here, a man that's coming from this warrior class, and he realizes, hey, I've done a lot of wrong in my life. Okay, so what he wanted is that he wanted to found a monastery where the monks would be freed from noble land rule, right? What we were just talking about in the previous slide. And the monks could dedicate themselves to prayer full time, specifically for him. Okay. Now that's an interesting thing, right? I mean, just think about that. This is a man, he's so concerned about the sins that he has committed that he wants an entire house of monks freed from the influence of the land rule, right? Because when William dies, he knows he's not, it's going to fall to it would have otherwise fell to his heirs to determine what happens to the monastic house. And they could have gone on praying for him, or there could have been strife that would have taken away from the monks' abilities to pray for him. Now, so he wants monks that are dedicated specifically to praying for him. So he summons a man that's known for his holiness, a Berno of Baume, and he does something very unique. So in 1910, he grants the land of the monastery to the papacy in Rome, whom this patristic monastic house would be subject to solely. So he frees it from ties to the land nobility and puts it under the protection of Rome. And this begins the seeds of something that will have ramifications down to our very day. And I just want to read a little bit of this at length here. This is the charter of the monastery. This is the monastery that William forms. This is from William's own hand. And this is his charter for the monastery of Cluny. This is what he says. To all those who live in the unity of the faith and who implore the mercy of Christ, to all who shall succeed them and shall be living so long as the world endures, I make known that for the love of God and of our Savior, Christ Jesus, I give and deliver to the apostles Peter and Paul the village of Cluny, on the river of Grosne, with its curbitage and its house, with its chapel and it that is dedicated in honor to Saint Mary, Mother of God, and of Saint Peter, Prince of the Apostles, with all of the property that depends thereon. I, William, with my wife Ingelberga, give these things to the aforesaid apostles. First, for the love of God, and for the maintenance and integrity of the Catholic faith. May the monks and all aforesaid possessions be under the power and dominion of Abbot Berno, who shall rule according to his knowledge and power so long as he shall live. After his death, may the monks have the power and liberty to elect as abbot and ruler the monk of their own order whom they shall prefer, according to the good pleasure of this election by our own power, or that of any man. Nevertheless, every 5 years they shall pay to Rome 12 pences of gold for the upkeep of candles of the Church of the Apostles. May they have as their protector the apostles themselves, and for their defender the Pontiff of Rome. So an important thing here in this, right? After his death, that is the death of Berno, the monks have the power and the liberty to elect as abbot and ruler the monk of their own order. Again, and I'm going to stress this several times moving forward, just sort of what it's not like William is thinking in revolutionary terms, but it's going to have revolutionary effects in terms of the effect that it has on the church, because it's pulling the monastery away from the influence by the secular rulers who in many ways, remember we said, William the Conqueror, and he realizes the wealth that is in some of these monasteries. So the rulers have a vested interest in seeing who, after an abbot dies, who takes over that abbot. And William's saying here, no, he wants the monks themselves to, according to their good pleasure of this election by our own power, that of any man, right? Any man that they see, that the monks themselves see, to take over. And again, let's just look at some of the historical context here. So look at what's happening in Rome, right? Go back to the other video. So as I mentioned at the end of the first video, all of these things are taking place concurrently, right? Rome is mired in the era of the Pornocracy, the dark ages of the papacy, where these factions, these families within the Roman nobility are controlling the papacy, and the papacy is very much tied up in its own world. At the same time, the kings and lords of various provinces in Europe are very much in control of what's happening in their churches and what's happening in with their bishoprics, with the episcopate, and with their monastic houses. So here, for the first time, as we're talking about, the monks are going to be freed from rule from those that own the land. But an interesting little thing just to keep note of here, Rome isn't so much interested in what's going on in Cluny. Okay. Now, while the papacy approves the charter of Cluny. So basically, on paper, it's saying, hey, we are in control of this monastery here in Cluny. In practice and in reality, Rome didn't really have much to do with what was going on in Cluny, at least here in the outset. So Cluny is very much left to itself. So the early reforms that come out of this. Now, I want to be clear about something because oftentimes when you read the history books about this, they talk about the reforms and they give it sort of a bad reputation in the sense that when people tend to think about reform, we tend to think about reform in a modern context, where in reality, we more think about reform today as a revolt, as an upturn of the social order or the political order or the religious order. And that's not really what's happening here with this. So I don't want you to think about this as a revolution in terms. I want you to think about it more in the truest sense of the word reform. So what do we mean by the reforms of these monks? Well, let's look at some things that they did. One of the things that they did is they highly centralized the structure of the monastery. So the early Benedictine monastic houses were very decentralized. So one monastic house, while they all followed the Benedictine rule to varying degrees, it really all depended upon the house itself to what extent that the house would follow the rule. And this is not the case with Cluny. So the monastery of Cluny becomes a very centralized, where the Cluny itself becomes the house upon which all the other reforming houses are answerable to. And and moving forward, you're going to find that these reforms become very popular in the surrounding areas. And so if you're a monastic house that's further north or further west or east or any direction, and you want to be tied to these Cluniac reforms, you would be answerable to Cluny. And one of the reasons why, just as sort of a incentivizing factor, when you became tied to the Cluny reforms, privileges were granted to your monastery, where the monastery would be put under papal power, taken away from to how much you are answerable to the local lords or king, wherein you would be answerable to Rome. So you would rather be answerable to Rome for many various reasons, including one, Rome was sort of tied up with itself, but two, a lot of these reforming monastic houses realized what the sway of local rulers having over their house sort of degrading their ability to be spiritual leaders. They're also involved in the lost perennies, which is if you go back to when William set up this charter, right, he wanted monks that were very much tied to continuous prayer. Now, the historical Benedictine monastic houses were very much tied into prayer and labor, working the land. Well, one of the unique things about this Cluniac reform was that they were being freed from working the land, because they actually do not it's a little bit of a complicated story, but they're freed from having to work the land, so they can devote themselves to perpetual prayer. And they become known specifically for their beautiful liturgies. And I just want to point this out just as like a little sidebar, but if you're ever looking to start a reform movement, maybe consider going the William Duke of Aquitaine route and setting up a monastic house that is dedicated nonstop to prayer, because I don't think that we should, looking back on this as Catholic historians, underestimate the value that this nonstop houses of prayer that start forming throughout Europe had on the reforming movement. All you need to do is go back and look at the previous video, and we're going to touch upon just what's going on with the papacy here in a little bit. But this idea of praying nonstop and how efficacious that is on the life and holiness of the church, just that's a little sidebar there. But they become known for that. They become known for they put a greater emphasis again on art in architecture, investments, and their books and their libraries, which is going to have profound effects moving into the High Middle Ages. And they put a re-emphasis on the ancient vows. In particular, there had been the vows of celibacy, and in particular, continence were the incontinence among the clergy had become so common. That is priests and bishops taking up concubines, taking up mistresses, that it becomes so common that it almost became seen as the norm. It became the norm, but it was not the originally the norm. So the emphasis here is on a re-emphasis on the ancient vows of celibacy and incontinence. And I think, if we want to wonder, okay, so how did the church receive this? And looking back, I'm big on how the church received certain things as a guide for how we as Catholic historians should interpret it. Well, the first six abbots of Cluny are all saints, right? We have Saint Berno, the original abbot. We have Saint Aldo, he's very well known. That's his picture there. Saint Aymard, Saint Majolus, Saint Idolo, and Saint Hugh, who was very important. His name will pop up again in the coming lecture on Pope Gregory VII. So we have the first six abbots of this monastic reform movement are all saints within the church. So that speaks to something about how the church sees this reform movement. Now, I just want you to take a few geographical considerations. First off, as we're talking about Rome being mired in its own little world, look at how far we are from Rome. So while the Abbey of Cluny is answerable to Rome, there's a little bit of distance here, a little bit of foot distance. And I mean, we're on the other side of the Alps, right? So you're in the heart of France at this point. And even beyond just where it is in context to Rome, I want you to look at where it is in context to the rest of the European world, right? It's sort of, now I don't have, I mean, Spain at this point would have been under the Al-Andalus, that would have been under Muslim occupation. But, Upper Germany and even up in the British Isles, this is sort of a heart, and it becomes a hub, and the monastic reforms sort of begin to spread out, right? So remember, we said all of these houses have an incentive to want to come under the patronage of Cluny, therefore proxy under the patronage of Rome. It becomes very, very popular in England. And so Abbey Cluny slowly but surely spreads throughout all of Europe. So meanwhile, while all of this is going on, right, we can't forget the context of what's happening in Rome. And while we have officially, at this point that we're going to touch base moving forward, have left the pornocracy, we're not out of the fire yet. As we'll see, we have a series of papal conflicts. And we're just going to run through these quickly because I'm just trying to show that while we're not in this era of the pornocracy, we're not necessarily in an era of peace and reform either, right? I mean, we have John the 13th imprisoned, forced to flee Rome. Benedict VI, murdered either by strangulation or starvation. We have Boniface VII, he's an anti-pope, twice banished from Rome. Benedict VII, exiled. John the 14th, murdered. John the 15th, flees Rome. Gregory V, exiled. Sylvester II flees Rome. And just to touch with one of these here, just to give it some context, because while we're not necessarily in the era of pornocracy, and the reforms of Cluny have not yet reached Rome fully, I want to point out that not all of these popes are evil popes, not the type that we were seeing before by far. And I want to point out one here, Pope Sylvester II. He begins the process. I don't know if he was the first. He might have been the first, but it becomes the norm later, where he wants to take on the name of a previous saintly pope in an effort to model himself after such. And you're going to notice in the next lecture, when we get to the Gregorian reforms, that a lot of these popes are Pope II Pope Victor II, so on and so forth. And what they were doing was they were hearkening back to a time before the pornocracy, before the degradation of the papacy, to a time of the saintly popes that they were going to model themselves after. And so this is Pope Sylvester's idea. Now, he was a brilliant polymath and a scholar. He was involved in reforming. He takes a stand against, and this is going to be very common moving forward with the Cluniac Reforms as they start to leave Cluny and enter into what is taking place in the European world at large. They take stands against simony, clerical concubinage, and corrupt bishops. For thanks for his attempts to reform, the Roman populace gets themselves worked up and they drive him out of the city. So the people, and I want to stress this as we move forward into Gregory in the next lecture, you have to keep in mind that when it comes time to reform, not everybody is going to be on board for reforms. So and I just want you to I want this to sink in to add to the complexity of even while we're trying to talk about this narrative. You have the reformers, okay, and you have the people that are writing for reform on the side of reform. Then you have the people that don't want to reform for various reasons, and you have them writing their own histories. So just to give you an example here, you will see, look at this depiction. This is a depiction of Pope Sylvester II. And he's depicted dancing with the demon here, or at least consorting with the demon. Well, under Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who we will talk about at length in the next lecture, who was at odds with Gregory VII, in attempts to discredit the papacy, there are legends written up of Sylvester's involvement in sorcery. Okay. So when you see an image like this, you're tempted to think, oh gosh, Sylvester, yeah, that's the one that consorted with demons. Well, keep in mind that even back then, there were warring factions against the reforms that are taking place. So you can't always take things on face value. There was propaganda today. Well, there was propaganda back then. So I just want you to and I'm not going to be able to go deep into this to get into all the complexity of it, but this is a complex situation. And as we're going into the reforms, one of the reasons that it's so challenging to speak up for Pope St. Gregory VII is that there were people on both sides, people that were for him and against them, and they both had their historians telling stories. So that's Pope Sylvester II. I personally, I think all of the talks of him being involved in sorcery are just nonsensical. He was, like I said, he was a brilliant polymath, and because of that, people at the time, there was a little bit of they weren't able necessarily to discern between authentic use of, let's say, things like mathematics and sorcery and divinization. Okay, so we're not out of the complexity of things yet. And prime example of this being the case is Pope Benedict, what do we got here? The ninth. And I want you to look at these dates. Notice something that's funny about these dates here, right? We have 3 dates for his papacy, okay? We have 1032 to 1045, again 1045, then we have 1047 to 1048. All right, so something's up, right? So we have this, and I don't know, I haven't looked through all of the historical records of images of the papacy, but when I pulled up this image, this seems to be a common one of him where he has his back and he's looking back over his shoulder. And I don't know what's up with that, but it's kind of fitting for his story in a way, because it gives him sort of a coy look to his portrait here. But anyways, later Pope Victor writes of his predecessor. Pope Victor III writes, his rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts of violence and sodomy. His life as a pope was so vile, so foul, so execrable that I shudder to think of it. So not exactly popular in later years. Now, he is from the Theophylact family. So this is technically an era that's known as the Tuscany papacy, because we're again mired in that family politics. And while he's not technically under the era of the pornocracy, he's right there in that stream, that common thread of what you find with the with the popes of that time. So his first pontificate, what happens here? Well, there's rumors. The rumors of his doings are so scandalous that he is driven out of the city. The populace drives him out of the city because his unspeakable acts of violence and sodomy are so worked up the populace. They drive him out. Pope Sylvester III replaces him. We're going to come back to Pope Sylvester III and Gregory the Sixth here in a minute, but just let's see if I can do this any justice. So his second time, he returns to the city. He claims the papacy, but shortly after, he decides, you know what, this was a mistake, and I'd actually rather marry my cousin. So he sells the papacy to a noble who in turn has Pope Gregory VI elected. Then he decides that was a mistake, so he regrets his resignation and then comes back to claim the papal throne again. So we have him on the register 3 times. As far as I know, he's the only pope. Somebody else may be able to clarify that, but I think he's the only pope that's ever served more than once. And this is a little bit of the complexity of what was going on surrounding that. So what all is happening here, right? So this is the papal schism before the well-known papal schism, right? So what's happening here? The first time Benedict's exiled, right? He's forced to leave Rome, and Sylvester is declared pope. And so you may be thinking, okay, how can Sylvester be declared pope if Benedict's the pope? And that's a good question. We have Sylvester under the register of pope. Some people have thought that Sylvester is an anti-pope, but he's not. And there's good reason for that. But without getting lost into that story, he returns, that is, Pope Benedict returns, and with the help of his family's private army, restores himself to the papacy. And there's some bloody fighting in the streets. This is still not a good time. So at this point, even while Sylvester sort of gives up, he's still technically a claimant to the papacy. Okay? So then we get, okay, so we talked about, right, it seems like quickly after that, Benedict tires of it again, and he sells the papacy to a man named Gregory the Sixth. Excuse me, he sells it to a noble. I don't want to imply that Gregory the Sixth bought the papacy, because we'll find out. He sells it to a noble who in turn makes Gregory the Sixth Pope. Now, this Gregory the Sixth is a holy reforming man. He is part of the Cluny reform movement writ large. So Gregory the Sixth is one of these reforming popes, but we're not quite ready for it yet. Now, again, Benedict XVI, you might be getting the impression here that he's not a man of strong conviction or fortitude, so he regrets his decision yet again and returns back to Rome. So at this point, you have potentially 3 candidates for the papacy: Sylvester, Benedict, and Gregory. Into this walks Henry III. Now, Henry III wants to be crowned emperor, and he's no fool. He's a man of he's a man of his time, in that he knows that if there's any type of questioning of his authority, if his authority is undermined, it could lead to trouble for him. So he doesn't want his authority undermined, and he will not tolerate this schismatic nonsense. So he crosses the Alps and he convenes the Synod of Sutri in 1046. Now, Sylvester attends, but he's already technically resigned his papacy, so he's not really a problem. He's resigned it to Pope Gregory VI. Now, Gregory VI, remember, he's a holy man, and it's at the Synod that he comes to realize the intrigue that had taken place, that he had technically received the papacy under the sin of simony. So he resigns, okay? Clement II is therefore declared pope. Now, Benedict resists his deposition, and after Clement dies, he returns for his 3rd pontificate, okay? But even he's eventually exiled, and he dies. It's said that he dies a penitent under the care of St. Bartholomew of Grotta Ferrata. St. Bartholomew. And St. Bartholomew writes that Benedict came to him and I guess under his spiritual care dies a penitent. So that's good. That's good for Benedict, okay? But in the meantime, Henry, with his synod, has sort of decided he's going to clear the mess up. Now, all that's going on in Rome. Meanwhile, back in Cluny, the reforms are still underway. And if you remember that image of where Cluny is located, they're starting to spread all over the place. Okay, the reforms are the Cluniac Reformed houses are starting to pop up all over the place. And you're going to get the sense here, especially moving forward, that these reforming monks are zealous to correct all of the abuses that are taking place. And I'm going to end with a saint. And I'm going to end with him, even though he's overlapping a little bit more into the time of our next lecture. I think St. Peter Damian here represents very well the zeal for this monastic movement. Now, St. Peter Damian, who is he? He began his career, I believe he was studying canon law. He was doing it from a secular perspective, and at some point he decides to give up his secular life and studies, and he goes to live a life of seclusion. He was even initially thought that even the Cluniac reforms were not zealous enough for him. So he goes to live a life of an ascetical life of penance, and eventually he befriends Hildebrand, Pope Gregory, who later takes the name Pope Gregory II, Hildebrand, who we're going to talk about at length next week. And St. Peter Damian takes up the wider cause of these zealous reformers, because I think he kind of realizes that the Cluniac reformers, even though they sort of begin, it's sort of like the snowball effect. It doesn't begin very fast, but it begins to pick up momentum. And once it really picks up momentum, it's an avalanche coming down the mountain, this reform movement. So he takes up the wider cause of reform. And I want his pen is something to behold. And what I mean by that is his writing is visceral and it's exacting. And if you ever come across the writings of St. Peter Damian and you don't have the context, it's easy to paint him as an extremist. But I want you to go back and just think about everything in light of all that we've discussed. St. Peter Damian is a man needed of his age. When you reach the level of debasement, of degradation, of just the Holy Mother Church being defiled such as it was, that it's going to take men of this kind of zeal, who maybe in other times would be viewed as extreme, but they're coming from eras of extreme corruption. Okay, and his pen, again, it's something to behold. I really recommend reading the writings of St. Peter Damian, but keeping in mind the time that he's coming from. I mean, he denounces abuse from top to bottom, from the papacy to the parish priest, right? Nobody escapes the wrath of St. Peter Damian, and he really helps to solidify the cause of reform that we'll see going forward. So that's all I got this time. I hope you guys are enjoying this. Stay tuned next time. It's going to be one of my favorite periods of church history. He's one of my favorite people, Pope St Gregory VII. And this, when I talk about the avalanche, the reform movements slowly starting as a snowball and turning into an avalanche, once you tune in next time for Pope Gregory VII, you probably won't view the historical what happens with the papacy later in the Middle Ages the same again once you hear the story of Pope Gregory VII. All right. So I thank you. If you enjoyed the stuff, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.